talk about manipulating Magento. Basically, something we do every day. We don't use Magento out of the box. We always make modules or small changes to it. And that's what I want to talk about today. When doing this, these changes, we always have to keep one goal in mind. And that is, first of all, that our customizations are bug-free and that they're future-proof. So if the Magento upgrades, then we don't have extra work to redo our code. Now, how should we do this? And I think the best way to do this is to keep the interactions with the core to a minimum. So how can you do this? I want to talk about three things, and those are preferences, plugins, observers, and then later on we're going to go through some cases. This is more of a talk, as you can see, to the topics for more beginner, for people who started out with Magento 2 or maybe working with it for half a year or something. But I hope I have some information for everyone. So let's talk about preferences. Why do you use preferences? Is to replace behavior. The first thing you need to know about preferences is actually dependency injection. Magento 2 uses dependency injection in the constructor, and also the object manager is there. So dependency injection is actually the concept that an external environment injects the objects that your class needs, and that your class does not need to make those objects. In Magento 1, those objects are injected via constructor, and the object manager is responsible for creating those objects. So this is a little code example from the core in the code address validator. This is the constructor, and as you can see, it has three dependencies: the address repository interface, the customer repository interface, and a session. One thing you have to note here is that two interfaces are injected. This is also a very important concept with injection, dependency injection in Magento, is the interfaces. If you open any Magento module, you will see an API directory. And if you open this API directory, you'll find the list of interfaces. And these interfaces are actually your service contract you have with this module. So if you want to use that module, it tells you, use my interfaces, and I promise you that in any future versions, without breaking changes, of course, that I will always provide you with this information. So for example, if there's an interface that has a module that says, if you give me an ID, I will return to you an order. So it promises you to do that across versions. So if you keep using interfaces, your code should be relatively stable across Magento versions. Now the next thing here, let's go a bit more to the preferences. This is a code snippet from the object manager. And here you can see the create function. So how does it create an object? It uses a factory to create it, and then uses the configuration to get a preference for a certain type. This is where preferences come in. So in your DI XML, you can define a preference. Basically, it says so if a class asks an instance of this interface or class, give it an instance of that class. So if it asks for a customer interface, give it a customer. One important thing to note about preferences is that there's only one preference can be active in your entire Magento installation. So if multiple models define the preference for the same interface or the same class, only one of those will be active. And which one that is active actually depends on the sequence of your module, so how your modules are loaded. So you can manipulate this by defining a dependency on another module. So in your module XML, if you say that your module kind of depends on another module, it will be loaded after that module, which also means that your preference will be used instead of that other module. So a little quiz. We have two modules. One module is the A module, one module is the Z module. They both have a preference defined for the, let's say, the customer repository interface. They both have a dependency on the customer module, which of these two modules will win, meaning which of these two modules will actually have the preference used in the installation. Anybody have any ideas? What? Second? That is correct. And the second one is used because, anybody know why the second one is used? Exactly. So modules are loaded alphabetically if they're not dependent on each other. So that is why the Z module will be loaded after the A module, and that is why his preference will be used. So our next topic is plugins. Plugins can be used to add and modify behavior of public class functions. So it's very important to note here that it's only can be used for public class functions. Again, plugins can be defined in your DI.XML. You basically, first of all, you say the class that has your public function you want to write a plugin for. Then you give your plugin a name and you say which instance is the plugin. There are three types of plugins, as you might know: the before, the around, and the after plugin. Let's go over them real quick. So first of all, the before plugin, let's just give the code example also. So a before plugin will run before the code of the original public function. It will get passed, first of all, an instance of the public class, and the second and third and so on parameters will be the parameters that are passed to the original public function. Then in your own function you can do something with those parameters. You can start new behavior or whatever. And then either you return nothing, or if you return NULL, it tells Magento that you have not changed any of the parameters. The second one is the after plugin. So very easy, it will run after the public function. It also will get an instance of the public class, and it will get the result of that function if there is a result. You should always return also the result, because else none of the people who code that calls to this function will get a result. So always return the result. And lastly, there's the around function. They run both before and after the public function. They will get an instance of the public class. They'll get a callable. This one is important. And then they also will get all the parameters passed to that public function. Important is everything you want to do before the original class, you should do before calling your callable, and then everything you want to do after it, you do after your callable. Now there's something important here is that you should actually call your callable, because there are some implications if you do not do this. So if you do not call a callable in your around plugin, the other around plugins that will be loaded after you will not be called. The original public class will not be called. And all the other after plugins that are loaded after your plugin will also not be called. So keep this in mind. There's some cases where it's valid not to call the callable, but usually just call it if there's no reason why you wouldn't call it, because else you might upset some other behavior. Now let's talk about the order. So the fun thing about plugins is that multiple plugins can be active for the same public function, unlike preferences. So in which order will they be called? I did some testing for this. First of all, you can add a sort order to your plugin. So you can say sort order 1, sort order 10, whatever. And all the plugins that will be called before the original public function will be called from low to high. So sort order 0 will be called before sort order 1. Then if they have the same order, which order will they be loaded in? Well, the plugins are sort with a UA sort PHP function. So it kind of depends of the result of that function. It has some weird behavior. I'm not going to go into that, but if you're interested, there's some results there that you don't expect. Then if they're sorted, then naturally all the before plugins will be run first, and then all the around plugins will be run, and only the part that is before the callable. Now, after that the original public function is called, then all remaining plugins will be ordered from high to low. So high sort order to low. So something with sort order 2 will be called before sort order 1. Then it will be the reversed order of that UA sorted array. Then next will be the around plugins will be called, everything after the callable. And as last, the after plugins. Also, funny behavior as how it is was if the high to low only happens if there's also an around plugin for that function. If there's no around plugin defined for the function, so you only have before and after plugins, then it will not do high to low, but low to high. So a bit difficult. So if you have a public function and it only has two after plugins, those will be called in the low to high sort order. To illustrate this, I will give away the answer with this already, but we have two modules. They both have an after plugin. We have a plugin called renderer A, and we have a plugin renderer Z. Renderer A has a sort order of 10, and renderer Z has a sort order of 20. Which of these plugins will be called last? Yes, Z, exactly. Because there's no other plugin active, so no around plugin, so they will be called from low sort order to high sort order. So plugin Z will be called last. This may seem like a lot of information, like, oh, I just want to write the one plugin, but I'm going to talk about a case later on where it's good to know the sort order. Lastly, let's talk about observers. Observers is a concept that was already there in Magento 1. You can use observers to modify data or to start new behavior. So an observer is executed every time the event is triggered that that observer is configured to listen to. Here's a little example of that in the session class. So here's a public function that sets the customer as logged in, and then the event manager is called to dispatch the customer login event, and the customer is added as data to that event. You can define your events in the event XML. You basically just say which event you want to listen to, and then you say which observer there is. If you create an observer, it must implement the observer interface, and that's basically it. It will get past an observer class, which you can use to retrieve the event data. Now, the drawback with events is you have to know the code. You have to know that there is an event triggered. If you want to modify a piece of behavior, yeah, if there's no event, you can't modify it by using observers. So always have to go look in the code, see what happens, and see is there any event I can use to my advantage. And the second thing is you have to look at the past data, because maybe you want to have access to some data to do something, but it's not passed to the event, so then the event is useless to you. So it's very important to know what events there are. And it's also a bit tricky because some events are not explicitly shown in the code. So if you go look to some event names that you know are triggered, you can't find those names anywhere in the code because they're generated. I'm gonna go through them because they're really handy events to know. And the first ones are the model events. So any module might throw one of these events, and you can't find them in the core easily. So you have, for example, the customer module. If you would write a log that writes away all the events that are triggered, you can find the customer load after, the customer save after event, etc. But you can't find these strings in the code. Basically, every module that extends from the abstract module and has an event prefix defined and an event object will throw all these events. So it's very, if you go look at the modules, always see, does it extend from the abstract module? Then maybe it has an event that I can use for this. This also applies to collections. Collections have a load after and a load before. If they extend from the abstract collection, and again, if they have a prefix and an object defined. This also goes for controllers, also very handy. They have a controller action pre-dispatch and post-dispatch with the route, so you can actually listen for a specific route when it's dispatched before you can do something or after you can do something. Only thing the controller has to extend from is the action. Now, because we talked about order before, let's talk about dispatch order of observers, because you can, of course, have multiple observers for the same event. How is this order defined? First of all, you have observers in different areas. You have the global area, you have a front-end area, you have a back-end area. Always the observers defined in the global area will be called first, and then all the observers in the admin or front-end area will be called. Now, in the same area, the sequence of the modules again is important. So modules that are loaded first, their observers will be called first. And then if you would have multiple observers in your own definition for a same event, the order in the XML just is applied. Okay, again, we have two modules. One has an event defined in the admin area. It's it's listening to the sales order save after, and the other module has an observer defined in the global area. Which of these two observers is triggered last? Any ideas? Exactly, the admin. Because first all the events of the global, all the observers of the global area are triggered, and then the admin. So the first observer will be called last. Okay, little recap. We saw some theory. We want to start getting into the practice. But before that, let's just quickly summarize what we just talked about. First of all, preferences. Preferences can be used to replace behavior. Advantages are that you can replace behavior of an entire class. Disadvantages, one preference can be active in your entire installation, and you actually have to replace the entire behavior. So even if you just want to change one little line of code, you still need to replace everything. Plugins can be used to add or modify behavior. Advantages is you can manipulate the behavior before, after, around. You have access to all the arguments, you have access to the result of the function. And also multiple plugins for the same function can be active at the same time. Drawback here is it can only be used for public methods. Then observers can be used to modify behavior or to trigger new behavior. Advantage is that multiple observers for one event can be active, and a disadvantage are, first of all, an event has to exist, else you can't use it. And you can only have access to that data that is being passed. Okay. Enough with the theory, let's talk about some cases. These are cases that colleagues of mine shared with me, which are cases that I on projects saw and thought would be interesting to demonstrate a couple of these things. Let's see how to do this, because I'm going to show you some actual code, and that didn't fit on slides. So my first case is, you're working on a project, there's this external module, it has an Ajax controller, which as a result adds JSON to your response, and you want to modify that JSON. You want to add something to it, let's say, or modify something. How will we do this? Let me just show you real quick here. Can everyone read this in the back? Okay. So this is my external module, very easy. It has a controller, it extends from the action. It has the execute function, it makes an array which is encoded to JSON and adds it to the response. And we want to, let's say we want to change the succeed to false instead of true. How should we do this? Let's go over the three things we learned. A preference. we can define a preference for this controller. But that means we have to change the entire code, have to adapt the entire code of all this controller, and this does not seem like a good idea. In my personal preference, I always like to see a preference as the final thing. If I can't do it any other way, then I'll use a preference, but if there's another way, I'll do it with that. So no preference. What's next? A plugin. So we could use a plugin. Why? Because the execute function is a public method. I'd say we'd use an after plugin, because actually we're just interested in doing something after the public function is run. So we're gonna need access to the response, of course, because else we can't change it. Well, luckily for us, this getResponse method is a public method. And since the instance of the class is also passed to your plugin, we can also call the public methods on that class. So we can get a response, and then we can modify the result some way, just add it to the response again, and send it on its way. So a plugin seems like a very good option. Let me just show you that code real quick. So over here I made an after plugin. As you can see, I use the subject. There's also no result because the public method did not have a return value. I can get a response, I can do some changes and set it back on the response. Done. So the third way is an event. We know our controller extended from action, which means it has those special pre and post dispatch events. So we could use that too. We could, let me just show you how you would do this. So first of all, let's go to the event definition. So here you can see it, the event name is the controller action post dispatch of the route I defined, and then the controller and the action. So if I go to the event, the nice thing about this event, the data that's being passed to it is also the actual controller. So again, I can use the controller to get a response, modify it, and yeah, it's being passed in the event. Now, which of these two would you use? They both kind of do the same. If you go performance-wise, they actually both perform pretty good. There's not really a difference between them. I personally would use a plugin more, because I'd like to use my event. I like to use my events more to trigger behavior, not to modify too much. I like to use my plugin more for actually modifying and doing more things. And events more for triggering new things, but that's a preference. Both solutions would do the same. Now let's go to our second case. There we go. There. So in our second case, we have this external web service that wants to know something about our order, and we want to send some information to it when an order reaches the state complete. How can we do this? Well, preference, does this seem a good case for a preference? No, no. You could use a plugin. Let's say you have an after plugin after the order is saved, and then we can check the data, see where it's changed, see where it's in the state complete, and then we could trigger our service. Okay, we could do it with a plugin. My preference here is to use an observer. There's because an order extends from the abstract module. It has those module events, and one of those events is the save commit after or something. It could be save after commit. I don't know the correct name, but it's something like that. And basically, it's an event that will be triggered if your order is saved and actually committed to the database. So I really like to use that event, because then I'm sure the change went through. The order is also passed. The order is also passed to this event, so you can use it to retrieve the original data and the data that's set on the order now. We can compare the states and see, oh, it has been changed to complete, and then we can trigger the external service. So in this case, I would recommend to use an event. Then our third Our third case I've added recently because I've worked on a project where I needed to do this, and it was quite interesting. So we want to redirect a customer. If it comes to our domain for the first time, we want to redirect it based on its location to a certain store view. So we want to see if its location is Italy and we have an Italian store view, we want to redirect our customer to that store view. How can we do this? So, and how can we do this in a performant way? Let me just quickly show you the Magento code that you can use to start your behavior. I want to point out the front controller. The front controller has this dispatch, public dispatch function. And basically what it does is goes match your route with a certain controller. So this seems like a good point to trigger that behavior, because I do not want the controller that is actually being called. I don't need that code. Also don't want to have any layout rendered. I just want to see, do I have to redirect this user, yes or no? And if he needs to be redirected, no other logic needs to be triggered, because it's going to end up on another page anyway. So if I could use this, that would be nice. So I used an around plugin for this, because I want to, first of all, I want access to the request data, but I also want to manipulate, or this function is called yes or no. Let me show you the plugin. So this is my around plugin. It checks or it should redirect the user. If it should not redirect, I just want the normal logic to be triggered. So I call my callable and return its result. If the user should be redirected, I do not call my callable because I don't need that functionality. I change my response and I return it. Now, here there's something very important about sort orders, because there's another exact same plugin active in the Magento core code, also an around plugin, for the full page cache. It actually does the same logic. Let me show you. So in Magento core, in the in the page cache module, there's a plugin active, the around plugin, that basically does the same. Before the routes are matched, it goes see, do I have this response in cache? If I do, just return it. Don't call the original front controller. And if I don't, just call the front controller. So basically, if this function, this plugin is called before my plugin will never be called. So the first time, if the page is not in cache, my code will be called and the user will be redirected to the site it needs to be. If the page is in cache, the user will never be redirected because it's in cache, the callable is not called anymore, and my code is not triggered. So here it's important to build in that my plugin is called first and then the Magento plugin is called. Now, how can you do this? Being a bit hacky about this. Well, the first definition is my plugin, and I gave the sort order 1. The original Magento plugin does not have a sort order, so it has sort order 0. So it's definitely loaded before mine. So I just added a different sort order here, 2, higher sort order than mine. This way I'm sure that my plugin will always be called before the original Magento plugin. Then my fourth case is you have a website and all the customer data is not stored in Magento, it's stored in some external service. So every time you go fetch a customer or want to save a customer, you actually want to go to this external service. How can you do this? This is a more theoretical case because I haven't tried this and I'm pretty sure it's not going to work this the way I'm going to explain it. So which of these tools can we use? A plugin, an event? That seems a little short for what we're going to do. Then I'm thinking of preferences. Well, a preference would be a very good option in this case. If you go to the code, there's this thing called a customer repository. You probably have heard of it. So you have customer repository interface, and the customer module has a preference defined which customer repository interface actual implementation should be used. So if I define my own preference for this customer repository interface, and if I implement all its methods, the save, the get, etc., and I would call the external service here instead of going to the Magento database, we kind of solve that issue. Again, I'm pretty sure this will not work 100%. If somebody tried it, please let me know. But the general ID would be applied for this. Now, last case I have in my list. Case number 5 is we want to change how the store address is rendered in an email template. So the template that is used for the store address, we want to change that. Let me show you what I mean. This is an email, and over here, your store address is rendered. And we want to render it in some different way. Let's say we want the country first, and then the street, and then the city, etc. How can we do this? So you have a renderer in the store module, which is used for this. It has one public function, the format function. It will get past the store information, and here you can see a hard-coded template that is used for the address. So if you want to change that template, we have to do something about this function. It's a public function, so we could use a plugin for this. We could use I think we'd need to use an around plugin because we need access to the parameters, but we also need to change the return value. But it doesn't feel right. You know why? Because we actually change all the behavior of this function. We don't just modify a bit. No, we're going to change everything. So that feels wrong. We could also use a preference for it, because if I look at this class, it actually just has one public function and a constructor. So if you use a preference for this renderer and make our own renderer, then we can make our own implementation of the public function. But again, it doesn't feel right, I think. We have to replace all this behavior just because we want to change the template of the store. Now, luckily, I'm gonna talk about some other solution you also have, is this behavior you see over here. This is a Magento 2.1. Since Magento 2.2.1, you can inject your template in the constructor, so you can much easily change it. And that's I want to give to you another option is this template that is injected. I actually made a pull request for this. I don't mean to brag, but I just want to explain something to you, is if you want to modify something and you look at all your options and you have something like nothing is good, well, you know, maybe go talk to someone or go think how should it be good and make a pull request. And that's also a way to solve your problems. So I kind of want to finish on that is you have everything that Magento offers you, but if you think you have a better IoT, make a pull request, contribute. That's also a good way to solve your problems. So that's the last thing I want to say in my presentation. Thank you all for listening. If you have a question.